So I'm going to talk about this idea about a community of practice.
Community of practice, I need to explain a little bit about what it is.
But it was one of those things, it's very nice when you've kind of done a bit of thinking and got some ideas in your head, and then you start reading what someone else has done and you realise, oh wow, this is really similar. And it was a kind of strange and rather satisfying experience to find out that we were on to something that I think other people have found useful elsewhere. So I'm going to just kind of very briefly go through, what we mean by ambit being really, if anything, not a single way of working, but an orientation that a team of people develop an approach that they are learning constantly how to do the work they do better and beginning to share it. Then I'm going to say what a community of practice is, and then I'm going to try to say a little bit about what we think ambit has in common with this idea of communities of practice.
And I guess, to state the bleeding obvious, we're all sitting in a room together. This is the first sort of proper ambit conference, and it's a great sort of thrill to be here.
And then I'm going to just talk very briefly about some of the next generation of what we're going to be doing in the manual, which is not the community, but it might be one tool that we use to support what we're doing a bit more. So let's just start at the beginning. This is a mentalisation-based approach. And mentalising, we all know, looks like this little guy. He's a mentaliser. In fact, when I first did this, and I showed this slide, Peter Fonagy was in the audience, and I said, of course, the joke is, of course, that only humans can mentalise, and dogs, they just don't have the bit of the brain to do it. And Peter came and said, actually, dogs are probably better mentalisers than most of the higher primates because they've co-evolved with humans. And being a dog owner, this made me feel good. And then recently, Liz found a fabulous, fantastic study of showing that dogs are fantastically good at mentalising, and a dog will steal food if the lights are arranged in a way that it can guess that the person can't see it. When the lights are arranged in a way that it can see that the person can see it stealing the food, it won't steal the food. So it's a really, really fabulous thing. So anyway, mentalising is all about this idea about the capacity to sort of sit back and question myself and my behaviours, about kind of why am I doing the things that I'm doing, to be able to put myself in somebody else's shoes and work out why this person might be reacting in the way that they are, to sort of develop this idea that minds are opaque, that I'm only a bit good at doing this, guessing and working out and imagining my way into somebody else's shoes. And if we're mentalising, we can get a bit more of a sort of
coherent story about how I came to be here in this situation now. The point about mentalising is that when we're in that frame of mind, that stance, the mentalising stance, we are open to learn new material. And very briefly, I want to mention there's some stuff that we've been putting in the manual, because this is really new research that's coming out from two researchers, both from Hungary, Gergely Csibra and George Gergely. And this is really interesting stuff. They call it the pedagogical stance and epistemic trust, terrible jargon. But it's actually a very simple idea that human beings it's incredibly complicated to live as a human being, and
we cannot possibly just sort of genetically inherit all the knowledge that it requires to live in North London in a particular community, to do things the way that would fit and would be seen as socially acceptable. Of course we have to learn a huge amount, and we need to be able to learn a lot, and we need to be able to know where to learn that from. And what they're proposing, and have got some very elegant science to demonstrate the sort of strength of this, is that there's a mechanism that we've evolved that allows us to know where and when to learn a lot from the right people quickly, and then to be able to apply that knowledge somewhere else. And it's effectively a bit like this temple door that I found a photograph of in Nepal. It's all in the eyes. Well, it's all in the recognition of my mind being represented in somebody else's mind. That when I see somebody else, has got me and why I don't really understand this, or why it's hard for me to be me right now, then I'm open. I start to mentalise, and we call this the epistemic sort of superhighway in ways. So it's this idea that until I get this sense that the teacher in front of me, or therapist, two are fairly interchangeable, I think, in ways, has got my dilemma, not general dilemmas of young people, but me here now. When I see that you've got it, something in me opens, and I will learn a lot from you quickly, but more than that, what I learn from you, I will then apply in other situations with other people. So I'll be able to generalise that knowledge. And there's some very elegant research that's, I think, really interesting. So it's really that mentalising and learning are kind of increasingly two of the same, connected to the same process. If we develop teams that have this kind of focus on this state of mind, the mentalising state of mind, making sense of behaviour by attributing a mind to the person who's doing that behaviour. What we're also interested in is then teams that are kind of constantly in a state of kind of readiness and openness to learn new material. And because if you're mentalising, you should be quite good at teaching and showing on. It's easy to be a better teacher if you're a good mentaliser. The notion of community of practice comes in. How do we develop not just one team that has some ideas and is doing it well, but a community of practitioners who are all working with similar but slightly different groups of young people? So it was this guy, Etienne Wenger, who I discovered on my journey through the web. So Wenger worked with an anthropologist called Jean Lave and wrote a very influential series of papers and books about 10 years ago, where they described this notion of a community of practice. Wenger himself was, I think, he might complain about this, but was a pretty fully paid up member of the geek community. He came from the sort of field of artificial intelligence, but kind of joined up with Jean Lave, this anthropologist, and they started to think about how do people learn and learn as a community. And these are his words. The term community of practice is relatively recent coinage, but it's a very old concept. And it's quite a different perspective on how we come to know and learn. And I guess, Ambit is about learning how we do the work we do and just incrementally getting it a bit better each time. So what they started was it was an anthropological study of this idea about what is apprenticeship. How, when a new worker joins your team, do they learn to do the work that you're already doing? And how do we learn anyway to do the work that we're doing? How do we actually do this learning thing? So, you might think, well, an apprentice, well, they have a master and they have this relationship between apprentice and master, and that's what it's about. And what they were able to show very clearly was that it was much, much more complicated than that. That actually most of what apprenticeship is about, lots of interactions with these sort of, people who've just finished their apprenticeship or people who are a bit further along the road of apprenticeship. That actually in some way, apprentices learn as much from their colleagues' apprentices rather than from some kind of great master who has all the answers and all they have to do is sort of stand in range and it all falls into their head. It actually doesn't work like that in a great range of places and people. And I think this is the point that I've added. Oh, sorry, I won't make it wobble too much. That, in fact, if you think about what I was talking about epistemic trust, if I talk to one of my colleagues and I know, because I can see in my colleague's face, you understand, this is really messy, this is really complicated, it's a bit worrying. And I can see, because I know that he's doing the same work, that you get my dilemma. Then when he says something about, well, I had a situation a bit like this and we tried this, I'll try that out. If I go to some sort of, great authority who deigns to kind of give me an answer, I don't know, somehow is that as much of a learning experience? But I think the argument is that epistemic trust probably happens as much with people that we know share our experience. So we can learn more. So it's this idea that a community of practice is a kind of living curriculum. And in ways, what I would want to argue is that the curriculum for how we work with hard to reach, complicated young people is much more embedded here in the people sitting in the seats than in some sort of nominal book of knowledge. And that actually communities of practice are everywhere. They're very dynamic. So what is it? Well, if you go back to the time in sort of medieval times, you've got the mercers, the drapers, the merchant tailors, the haberdashers, the cloth workers, the dyers, the weavers, the broderers, God knows what a broderer is, an upholder, something else. And there's hundreds of these medieval, they were called guilds. And basically, this is the beginning of a community practice where work became a bit more specialised, and people like hanging out with people that are doing the same kind of work. Why do they like hanging out? Because they just like sharing what I'm doing with what you're doing and comparing and swapping tips. You know, how do you get that tool so sharp and things like that. So this has been going on forever, and I think what we would be wanting to say is that being a bit more explicit about that is very much where Ambit would sit. What we're interested in is moving from implicit practice, where we just do it because we've always done it like that, to doing it in awareness. Another way of looking at it, and I think I've got a quote here that, no, maybe not, that a group of nurses, for instance, who just regularly have lunch together in the canteen, it's kind of a community of practice, because I know what nurses do when they get together. They talk about their patients, don't they? They talk about, oh yeah, you know, I had this, I had that. And I'm suggesting that, you know, kind of the fact that all of us could be bothered to come here today is because actually we're all a bit curious about what each other does. So to me, the community of practice has something I think really valuable for us to think about.